The multipolar world is hardening under the stress of war, trade conflicts, and geopolitical crises into two major camps. And it feels like the world is dividing in half. Is this a new Cold War, or are we marching to World War III? Hello, I'm Michael, and this channel looks at power, geopolitics, and decline from a Southern realist perspective. Let's look at what's happening right now. So, energy is the major fault line in Europe, and we see this in the recent actions from Hungary and Slovakia. Both of those countries, which are inside the EU, have cut diesel to the Ukraine. Now, this has come as a reaction to the Ukraine not repairing the Druzhba pipeline that flows from Russia through the Ukraine to Hungary and Slovakia. Much of Eastern Europe used to get oil from this pipeline, and Slovakia and Hungary are still pretty much completely dependent on this pipeline for their economy, for their survival, the well-being of their people. So they are absolutely dependent on Russian oil. Despite efforts from the US and the EU to force them off of Russian oil, to force them onto much more expensive US LNG. That's what Brussels and the US would like. However, it would cost the Ukraine or cost Hungary and Slovakia a lot of money. It would do a lot of damage to their economy, to their society, and it would also be a strike at their sovereignty. Are these not independent nations? Are these not independent countries? Can they not make their own energy policy? Can they not trade with whoever they would like to trade? Well, apparently not if you talk to Brussels. So this is not just about fuel, it's about alignment under coercion. And that's key because there is a lot of coercion going on. And finally, let me just point out the obvious. If you're following what's going on in Europe, Slovakia and Hungary both have populist governments. Slovakia on the left, Hungary on the right, but they are very closely aligned on a lot of these issues because ultimately sovereignty matters a lot more than maybe your tax policy, whether it's 15 or 20% or something like that. Whether you're an independent country matters more. And so the EU is really trying to pressure these populist governments to fall into line. At the same time, the most popular parties in the biggest economies in the EU are populist parties. They're mostly right-wing nationalist populist parties. And a lot of those countries could soon come under populist government. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. Let's move on to Russia expanding its perimeter. So Russia now is trying to counter U.S. actions against Cuba. It's trying to supply Cuba with humanitarian fuel, and it's trying to block the U.S. blockade of Cuba. And it has aligned with Cuba. It's given Cuba political support. All this doesn't really amount to a whole lot, though, to be honest. In the end, if the U.S. wants to take Cuba, it probably will. Cuba's right off the coast of Florida, 90 miles away from Key West. If you've ever been down there to the southernmost point of the U.S., you can't quite see Cuba, but it's not far away. And it is a long ways away from Russia. It's just not feasible, really, for Russia to help out Cuba too much, but they are trying. Now, we saw the same thing happen in Venezuela. Venezuela was a clear Russian loss to the U.S. Donald Trump made it a priority. He went down there with a massive show of force, removed the president, and now has a president in power in Venezuela who seems to be willing to work with him. So that is a major alignment shift in South America. What we see overall, though, are major powers testing each other's fears again. We see this in the U.S., helping to overthrow the government in the Ukraine, instituting a pro-NATO government there. Of course, not all the U.S. fault. It's not just a U.S. coup. There were Ukrainian forces that were involved in that, but the U.S. heavily supported that coup. We see the U.S. in Syria, where it helped to overthrow the Syrian government, a pro-Christian, nationalist, secular government, basically. This was a defeat for Russia. Russia had military bases there and was supporting the Syrian government. The Syrian president ultimately fled to Russia in the end. We see this in the U.S. in Iran. This one's more of a draw. I would say probably more of a win for the U.S., but really a draw because Iranian missiles showed that, or Iran showed that their missiles could penetrate Israeli and U.S. defenses, that they could strike back with force. And they could always close off the Gulf there if they wanted to and strike U.S. bases, which are literally all around Iran. Iran is almost surrounded by U.S. military bases. So they could easily strike these bases. So who knows what's going to happen, but it looks like the U.S. is gearing up to attack Iran yet again. We also see this in Greenland. This also, we don't really know what's going to come of this. Maybe a draw. The U.S. might have increased its influence there, but ultimately it backed down on acquiring Greenland outright. So maybe a loss for the U.S. there, maybe a draw, who knows. But what we see is Cold War behavior as these major powers are testing each other's spheres of influence all over the world. And as they get closer and closer to those major powers, things get more intense. Like we see in the Ukraine, which is literally right on Russia's border, and half the country is full of Russian-speaking people. So that's as close as you can get, as close as you can get, and so therefore you see why we have a major conflict there. I also want to say that things are looking a lot like an election map in the U.S. and less like a multipolar world. We see safe red and blue states, basically, safe red and blue countries, and we see a handful of swing states. Now, the major swing states in the world are India and Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Turkey, Brazil, and others. But the biggest one is India. India has the world's biggest population. They have a tiny economy compared to the size of their population, but it is rapidly growing. And they have a nationalist, populist government there. India is trying to walk a tight line. They're buying Russian oil because it's the cheapest energy they can get. They have defied U.S. demands to stop buying Russian oil. They're not going to stop doing that. They have avoided war with China so far. That's key. China's a the other major power in Asia, and right there on their border. Really, India is trying not to be a proxy for either side. They want to go their own way. They want to retain their independence, their sovereignty, their national identity, and who can blame them for that? But if they hold independence, then multipolarity survives. If these list of swing countries, if they hold their independence, then multipolarity could survive. If they're forced into these hardening camps, then bipolarity returns, and things will be much more dangerous, I would say. So the big question is now, is this a messy but stable multipolar system that we're in now? Or are we in a transitional phase where the world is hardening into two rival camps? That's really the big question. World War III is not guaranteed yet. Maybe 1 million people killed in the Ukraine. It's horrifying, terrible what's going on there. But it does not mean that we are marching to World War III, that millions more people are going to be killed on both sides. That does not necessarily mean that. But we are in a time of elevated risk with these bloc formations. We've seen this in the past. In the lead up to both world wars, we have bloc formations. We've seen it in the lead up to other major wars in world history, where you had these blocks form and then fight each other. And I'm thinking of like ancient Greece and ancient Rome. You had the same thing happening there. So elevated risk for sure with this block formation. What we need to do is watch the swing states. Is India forced into one of the two camps? Is Saudi Arabia forced into one of the two camps? Traditionally, it's been on the U.S. side, but it's trying it's trying to go its own way. And we see that with other countries like Turkey, taking definite steps to go its own way. Will these countries be forced into one of these two blocks or not? And also the major EU elections. What will happen in the UK, France, Germany, and a few of the other countries will really determine a lot of this. Um, the EU institutionalists, the elites, they have all the power. They're trying to hold on to it, but the most popular parties in those countries are right wing populist parties. And so we shall see what will happen in the multipolar or the bipolar world.